Greetings, everyone. For those of us who are joining us for the Future of Democracy lecture series, bear with us a moment while we let people in from the waiting room, and we'll go ahead and get started in just a moment. See you in a second. For those of you who are joining us live in the room, the chat should be open to you, and you can please feel free to say hello. Let us know you're here. We don't want this to be a black box webinar where we don't know who's out there. So please, we feel free to send your greetings. We always get people coming in from all around the world, and we'd love to know who's here. So please feel free to type your name in. Just a few other housekeeping matters while we go ahead and wait for people to come in and get started. There is, in addition, the Q&A button, which you'll see at the bottom. So as Deb is talking, if you want to get in the queue to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A. You can, again, feel free to use the chat as we're going along to share comments. But if you have a question specifically for Deb, I would suggest you put it in the Q&A so that we can see it, but we welcome the dialogue and the ongoing commentary and reactions, obviously, in the chat as we're going along. We also have live transcription taking place, and there's a button you'll see at the bottom. So for those who are hearing impaired or need a little extra visual assistance, or would like to practice their English, please feel free to click the live transcript button at the bottom. So we're still, I see, amassing people who are coming into the room. But in the interest of time, why don't I go ahead and get started? And for those people who haven't been with us before, introduce myself and the series, and that will give a few more minutes for people to arrive before Deb gets started. My name is Beth Novak. I'm a professor at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering and director of the Governance Lab, and a senior fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge. IPK, Institute for Public Knowledge, and the GovLab together sponsored this series on the future of democracy, which is our way of exploring hopeful new trends in the future of democracy and of governance. Given recent events, we have talked quite a bit also about the challenges of democracy and the problems, but we never dwell only on the pessimistic. We never dwell only on the past. We never talk only about the challenges. We're very much here to talk about how we might reimagine, reinvigorate, and strengthen our democracy. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and dive in and introduce our guest today. I'm very, very delighted to have an old friend and collaborator here, Deb Roy. Deb is professor of media arts and sciences at the MIT Media Lab, where he directs the MIT Center for Constructive Communication. And he's also executive director of the MIT Media Lab. He leads research in applied machine learning and human-machine interaction, with applications in designing systems for learning, and as we'll hear more about today, constructive dialogue and deliberation, and for mapping and analyzing large-scale media ecosystems. Deb was also co-founder and CEO, as many of you know, of Bluefin Labs, which was a media analytics company that was subsequently bought out by Twitter in what was then the largest acquisition in Twitter's history back in 2013. And from 2013 to 2017, Deb served as Twitter's chief media scientist. I might also add he was, for a time, a collaborator on our joint MacArthur Research Network on opening governance, very much bringing his expertise to bear on the questions that we're going to talk about today with regard to the future of democracy. He's the author of over 160 academic papers, but for those of you who want a little tastier bit, you can also check out his TED Talk, which I'll put here in the chat, and we'll make sure to tweet out to people. That's had almost 3 million viewers. The TED Talk is, of course, focused on his research on his son's language development that led to pioneering new ideas in media analytics. But today we're going to hear Deb talk about his new venture, the project known as Cortico, and I won't say anything about it because I'm going to leave it, Deb, to you to do that. And welcome. We're happy to have you here. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk about the Local Voices Network. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And great. So this initiative is the result of a combination of two organizations. The first is Cortico, a nonprofit organization which is operating and developing and supporting the Local Voices Network in cooperation with a newly formed research center at MIT, the Center for Constructive Communication, which grew out of our previous research lab that I led at the Media Lab, and is based at MIT. And this is just an image of many of the people, both from Cortico and from the center, that have participated and are working on the Local Voices Network. And I want to also just call out Professor Kathy Cramer, who is a political scientist from the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and has played a key role in shaping and the formation of the Local Voices Network. And we actually launched in our hometown, as you'll learn about soon. And down below, I also wanted to acknowledge Reid Hoffman and Craig Newmark and Ali Ragani and the Knight Foundation as key supporters for this work. So I want to just frame where the Local Voices Network came from. And it was really, as in our lab at MIT, we've done a lot of work in analyzing social media, both network structure, diffusion of information, how false information spreads, and so forth. But I just want to begin by acknowledging that social media has brought a lot of great value to our lives and world. And when we think about all the new voices that have been able to enter into the public sphere, new movements like the Black Lives Matter and Me Too, where social media clearly played a role, a positive role, and yet we are all too aware of the harms being spread by social media, the kind of antisocial dynamics of hateful speech and bullying and false information that is spreading in a way that is contributing to current polarization and fragmentation, and even in some cases, as we've seen, mobilization of violent groups. And down on the ground, what the climate is like, increasingly it feels like, is that our public spaces are full of shouting and extreme positions being staked out, reactive, disconnected from everyday life, leading to a divisive environment. And this is not just on social media, mainstream media and their entanglements are all contributing to this sort of polluted climate. And what we, I feel, desperately need is to create, sort of imagine and start creating new spaces that have very different properties, where we can go into spaces where the expectation is that we're here to listen and listen deeply, where nuanced and reflective conversations that are grounded in our everyday lives is the norm, which can lead to more constructive kinds of exchanges where we can actually construct a better understanding of others, and where certain groups are not being heard, actually have a more inclusive environment where those voices can be surfaced. And that was really the sort of ideals or the direction that led us to shift gears from analyzing the social media environment to thinking about how we can create a new opportunity. So just going back for a minute to think about what one might call sort of tech-first social platforms, some of the properties that many of them have in common is that ultimately driven by commercial needs, there's a set of optimizations in their design for growth and addiction, of keeping people on the platforms, of leveraging to the maximum possibility the global reach and the instant speed of the internet that they're all built on, and increasingly a pattern of using artificial intelligence algorithms, sort of machine learning that feeds on the data to make decisions on behalf of people for both what they see and who they connect with. And when you kind of roll all this up, there's a kind of general pattern on these platforms in terms of the effect on humans, which is disinhibition and amplification of bad behavior. And I think it's just interesting to think about an analogy here of how we behave in pedestrian traffic and what happens when we advance the technology for, in this case, transportation, and enter into machines, basically where we are wrapped in glass and metal that allow us to move faster, go farther, and actually connect with others. So really, cars are a social technology, but the experience for the people inside these vehicles, we all know that there is this disinhibition effect where certain kinds of behaviors become more common. And when the glass and metal container is your smartphone, we still have a similar kind of effect, I think, for actually similar reasons. A very important book, and sort of the author behind it, E.F. Schumacher, is Small is Beautiful. This is an economist who was really concerned about economics and economics theory that takes into account extractive nature of technologies on the environment. And this was written over a half century ago, but I think is extraordinarily relevant for sort of thinking about what's going on. A key concept for Schumacher was this, that when we think of progress in technology, we think of foot loosening technologies, which essentially, my understanding of Schumacher was that progress is measured as technologies allowing us to act at a greater and greater distance. So whether it's a communication technology, transportation, or military sort of weaponry, that progress is equated with transcending distance. And the problem is that when you act at a distance, the impact, the results of that action take longer to get back to you, and the feedback signals become more diffuse. And because of that, our basic ability to self-regulate our behavior breaks down. And so Schumacher suggested that we design human scale technologies. He was not a Luddite saying, let's just reverse and undo and block technology, but instead, let's create technology that's decentralized, that's appropriate to the scale of human sensibilities so that we can have those self-regulatory loops be active. And so this is really the inspiration for the Local Voices Network, to think about a human-first social platform, the kind of bicycle for the internet or social media, as opposed to the automobile. And we begin with grounding this in facilitated group conversations in trusted context. So the key is to tap into learned social skills for how we behave when we're in small groups, where there's some agreements and shared purpose for why we're entering into those conversations, where we can focus on surfacing underheard voices to make sure those who typically would not show up in the town hall can show up in these smaller contexts. And then provide mechanisms for connecting across enclaves, across different divides. To leverage the power of AI, but rather than allow the role of AI technologies to be deciding who connects with whom and what they're exposed to, instead channel AI into tools, what we call power tools, that equip humans to shape and scale digital networks. And I'll share with you a couple of examples today of how we're starting to see Local Voices Network have impact in areas of journalism where we want to bring voices into the media and amplify voices that normally are not reflected, and shape civic processes and inform community programs. Okay, so let me take you in now to some of the details of how Local Voices Network has been designed. So the idea is to scaffold and scale facilitated conversations, kind of treat technology as sort of training wheels for creating the kind of behaviors we're trying to see flourish. We began in a pre-pandemic era with the design of this piece of hardware. This is the digital Hearth, a cherry wood model where you are invited to to come together around a hearth and both be recorded, have your voice recorded, and be able to hear voice of others, where this inside is computation that connects to the cloud and does all sorts of stuff in the backdrop, and a controller, which was meant to be a place that would allow the facilitator, what we call the host of the conversation, to control the device, but also where we could start introducing some nudges and prompts to help the facilitator play their role. And we developed, working with facilitation experts, a conversational structure where small groups, 4 to 8 was sort of the sweet spot, would enter into some agreements for how they would come together in this conversation, provide consent to be recorded, and have those recordings be made publicly available. And after some connecting questions and an exchange of kind of stories to kind of connect the group, we'd get into the heart of the conversation, which is to open up and allow everyone, the participants, to shape the agenda and share hopes and concerns that they have regarding their own community, grounded in personal experience. There could be topical versions, hopes and concerns about taking the vaccine would be a very natural topic today, and wherever possible to share personal stories. And you will hear some voices coming from our pilot work in the next few minutes. In fact, we're going to hear 3 or 4 minutes of voice over the next 20 minutes, and then some reflection and finish. So this is just a picture of an early version of our handbook. We started this work working with Kathy Cramer in her hometown of Madison, Wisconsin. And in early 2019, started outreach through personal networks, and then in collaboration with the public library systems in Madison, to invite members of the community who were interested in taking a 2-hour training to learn both the facilitation, sort of the conversation structure, and familiarize themselves with the physical hardware. And then we started reaching out through these trained host networks. And increasingly now we've shifted to also partnering with community organizations to invite groups into small conversations, and then actually proceed to have these conversations around the hearth in a pre-pandemic era. And as the pandemic reached us, we shifted to Zoom as the way to bring people together with the same back-end technologies to connect across conversations. And really Zoom freed us from the constraint of having to have physical hearths in circulation in a community, and let us much more rapidly expand across the country. So what are these conversations like if you actually joined one? The way many have described them is that they're powerful. You feel connected to the others in the group. There's deep listening to one another, relating personal experiences. Our hosts are really encouraged to engage in discomfort and enable participants to take risks with curiosity and vulnerability, and really to draw out stories that we are not hearing in other settings, whether it's in social media or talk radio, local television. It's a kind of personal experience that just really doesn't seem to surface in other settings. And meanwhile, these conversations are really designed to avoid domination by the loudest and by the experts, where provocative statements not grounded in experience are really not part of the mix. People asking leading questions, being asked poll sort of questions, not in the mix. And trying to convince others out of their views is really not the purpose and not what is happening in these conversations. After each conversation ends and the recording is uploaded, it becomes soon available in a conversation browser, which you're seeing here, that allows anyone with access to our network to browse through the topics that are surfacing automatically by analysis, or choose a topic such as education, and actually go into the full transcript, find moments in the conversation, see the context they occur in, and then you can actually select a piece, select it as a highlight that because you think it's important and worth sharing, tag it, and that lifts both the text and the associated speech with it out of that conversation and makes it available for sharing. So I want to now show you and let you listen to a couple of excerpts just to start getting a sense of the texture of the voices that are now flowing through, as we've had thousands of people participate in these conversations that tend to be about 90 minutes. And it's actually remarkable how fast the time goes, and often participants after will wonder when the next conversation might be. So this is an image of the beautiful city of Madison, Wisconsin, and the icon here depicts 2, but as I mentioned, we tend to have anywhere between 4 and 8 people. So once a conversation is held, and this might again be by a community organization that reaches out to members of their community, and I'm actually going to play you in a minute an example from a group of public school teachers who were gathered in a conversation. And we began with conversations where we were just asking about general hopes and concerns about life in the community in Madison as you think about today and the near future. And so that conversation with 4 to 8 people is recorded. It's uploaded into our servers in the cloud, indexed, transcribed, semantically indexed, and made available to others in Madison. One of the interesting things that we can then do is a second host of a conversation sometime in the future may draw a different group together from a different enclave in Madison. And they are able to then take one of those audio highlights and with very little effort, bring it into their conversation and play it. We call this cross-pollination. This is the ability to bring one voice from one conversation into another. So what I'd like to do now is play for you a 1-minute clip, and you're going to hear Darcy, who is a school teacher. He teaches in a public school in Madison, and just in the context of the conversation started talking about the presence of police in schools. And then you're going to hear a response from someone in a different conversation to this clip. So this is first the teacher speaking.
So yeah, I mean, my experiences with officers in the schools is that they do everything they can not to arrest kids. Mm-hmm. And they're extremely kind and very, very, very positive role models for kids in the schools. You know, the schools I've worked in, some of the resource officers are people of color, and they're working with students of color, and they're able to see a police officer in a responsible role, being good with kids, being supportive, and so, you know, I know that there's privacy issues and things, but you see these groups of people who like walk through schools like once a year or twice a year, and then they like kind of poke their noses into places here and there, and then they think they can develop an opinion about something, and they couldn't be less informed.
So a couple of weeks later, this clip was played after it was first recorded to a group of predominantly Black citizens of Madison who were formerly incarcerated by someone who knows and works with this group in sort of a reintegration program. And one of the members of that group, Aaron, listened to the clip you just heard, and it wasn't an immediate reaction, but 5-6 minutes later, after that clip was played, Aaron spoke. And when he references that guy that he listened to, he's referencing the clip you just heard. So here's Aaron's response.
I was listening to the guy, and I actually was listening to his voice. And I totally can hear some of the things he was saying, but I just can't see how that is effective. And the last thing I will share, I remember to this day, like it was yesterday, I remember I was going through a teenager temper tantrum. And I was just I was just out of control, totally. And this is while I was in the institution, but I was a juvenile, and I remember a guy by the name of Bruce. He grabbed me. I was just out of control. He just grabbed me, put his arms around me, and just held me. And I was trying to get away and all of those things. He just didn't let me go. He didn't allow me to hit him or none of the above. Ultimately, I tired myself out and I just cried. but he didn't hurt me. He didn't disrespect me. He didn't belittle me. He allowed me to calm down, and then he started to talk to me. And I say that because to this day, that was an act of love. And it was not an act of disrespect. And so I think when it comes from the family and from the community, it's a better perspective versus as it coming from the police, because police gonna do just that. They're gonna police.
So there's this kind of rich conversation that is spreading through these conversations, sometimes through cross-pollination, but first and foremost in the groups themselves. Of course, you have a built-in audience and a kind of ability to be heard. And meanwhile, there is a public archive of all of these conversations that are accumulating. And so we have also developed tooling to be able to enable pattern analysis across collections. So here you're seeing someone click on the topic of criminal justice. So we've actually been leveraging other data sets from, in this case, talk radio, to take very large volumes, billions of words of talk radio, in order to develop a model, a topic model that is easy to interrogate. You can see all the terms that the machine learning has decided are related to this topic. If it seems like there are biases or words that don't belong or are missing, there's an iterative process of retraining this model that can then be used to search across all conversations and allow someone who has access to this network to drill in and go deeper into the specifics of the conversations. So we've made this, this kind of public archive search and browse tool available to a number of now media organizations. This is an example. The Cap Times is a paper in Madison, one of their first. They've now done a series of stories. This was one on racial disparities. And we've created a media embed so that you can actually take a clip of audio and embed it into the story. Here's another example, much more recent, just in January, published by Frontline in collaboration with Milwaukee PBS. And you'll hear a little bit of a voice here from a rural dairy farm.
The last couple of years in the dairy industry, there's been a lot of times I don't think there's been a farmer out there that hasn't thought, oh, maybe I should do something else, you know, because it's just been really hard financially.
And in fact, one of the original goals working with Kathy was to really create a network that could connect voices and perspectives from across rural Wisconsin and urban Wisconsin. So starting to see some of these voices flow into the reporting, in this case in Milwaukee, is really starting to sort of deliver on some of that original idea stemming from Kathy's own work in understanding rural consciousness in Wisconsin. So I wanted to, before I wrap up, just take you through in a little bit more detail a case study with working in collaboration with the Madison Police and Fire Commission. Just to set some context, the Madison PFC last year announced after the sudden departure of the police chief of Madison, and this happened under racially charged conditions, that they recognized that they needed to do something different and bring community voices into the process of their next police chief search. And so they actually asked to partner with us and you really use the Local Voices Network as one of the inputs for their process. And so we worked with them and helped organize about a half dozen community conversations where people from marginalized communities were really sort of a focus to bring them into the process and have them share hopes and concerns as it related to public safety and policing in Madison. And along with those conversations, sort of one of which is depicted here in shorthand form, kind of our sort of speaker turn-taking ribbon visualization of speech, we actually had hundreds of people who had already participated in other conversations, not tied specifically to the Police and Fire Commission, but it turns out when we did our topic analysis that just organically, many of the conversations turned one way or another to public safety and policing. And so we developed a method to then code these audio snippets, and in particular highlight those that were coming from people who had lived experience that were directly impacted by interactions with police in Madison. And we focused in on those components of the audio, the speech, and clustered them into themes. So this is the last segment. I actually want to take about 2 minutes and just play for you some kind of highlights of different audio that came out of this analysis across a couple of hundred people in Madison.
It's hard to get away from how powerful, you know, the institution and the badge and having a gun is, and how much that emboldens individuals.
Well, I mean, growing up, one of the first values and principles that I was taught was to never trust the police in any situation or circumstance. And then that was kind of proven to me around age 12 or 13 when I saw a family member be shot in the back 8 times.
Yo todavía tengo pavor, el pavor que tenía cuando no tenía la licencia, que cada vez que veo si eran como unos 10 patrullas ahí, a ver a quién iban a agarrar.
Yes, the boys are, but more so the men. And it's a shame because if we say comply, don't make any sudden movement. Keep your hands where they can see. If they say get down, get down. That does not guarantee that they will live. But then what are we teaching our sons? We're also teaching them, but they don't feel this hurt and this pain. We're also teaching them to sit there and let them be treated less than.
Law enforcement community relations, because we have had a lot of problems in this town of people policing communities that they don't know.
Right. School is a place that we should feel safe. And for Black children, for children of color, police do not make, I mean, at least I can speak for myself, do not make me feel safe.
That there's a lot of things going on that I think, you know, the police can't do everything by themselves, and they also need to reach out and make those key partnerships.
They are police and they police, that's what they do. And they're not counselors, they're not social workers. And so all of those factors are not even in the equation.
It's my philosophy that those who are closest to the problems are closest to the solutions, especially in the criminal justice system. We're experts.
And the police in this community and the communities across our country don't look at people who need support and people who need someone to guide them or just be there for them through their struggles. They see them as a problem. They're not a problem, they are people.
So for each of these themes, we developed a systematic method to convert them into a suggested question to ask a candidate who is being considered for the job of police chief. So for example, from these conversations, it seems that police fear some of the communities they work in, and based on that observation, we then posed a question. We packaged all of this analysis into a report where we had a summary of each theme. Each link goes to a specific audio sample of someone sharing an experience that backs up the summary, which then in turn is converted into the corresponding questions. The police and fire commission in early December made their selection of the final 4 candidates. And then in mid-December, they did a series of public interviews where they used primarily the questions that were sourced from the process I just took you through. So I'll just play, this is the last clip, about a 40-second clip of one of the questions about fear being put to one of the candidates, Joan Barnes.
It seems that police fear some of the communities they work in, and communities fear the police in return. What fears have you observed in the communities you've policed in, and what strategies might you deploy to help heal the harms that cause these fears?
So I believe that fear fear is a result of not understanding.
So Sean Barnes was in fact sworn in just a couple of weeks ago by Jackie Bojess, who was a member of the Police and Fire Commission, and it's the commission that made the ultimate decision for hiring. We did a debrief with Jackie, and this was just something she said in passing in the experience of working with LVN in this process.
I think people can feel that somehow that voice was heard in a way that it usually is not heard in Madison.
Jackie went on to describe how usually when they have town hall meetings, there's no different in this case, what she calls for the usual suspects show up, get their 3 minutes with the mic, and that a lot of people from marginalized communities don't really believe that that's a space for them, would not show up, but they actually did participate in these conversations. So it's kind of like a decentralized or deconstructed town hall where the network then allowed those voices to come together. So just to summarize each of those questions that went into this publicly video broadcast interviews were grounded in a whole collection of voices which are publicly explorable. And so you end up with this process which is we believe more inclusive than having a kind of open town hall where the conversations leave a durable voice record, which is transparent, which is explorable. And because everyone who knows they participated knows that everyone can see that, and there's this kind of mutual visibility, which creates a kind of ratchet effect in increasing accountability to the process. So we just started to imagine now, first of all, with Sean Barnes now sworn in, he has committed to listening to the community more effectively. We believe that LVN could actually create a kind of channel for the police chief to consult with the public. So we are having those conversations now in Madison. And beyond selecting a police chief, there are other positions and leadership roles in public office where we think this whole similar process could be extended. So just to close, can it scale? We are developing various concepts now to think about advancing the technology for the analytics, to create new ways to leverage these recorded conversations to help accelerate how we can teach and scale the art of facilitating these kinds of conversations. And meanwhile, if we just look at recorded minutes now of conversation across both public and sort of protected collections, we're seeing a very nice kind of traction. The number of cumulative highlights of people actively going after these conversations are recorded and listening to them and lifting out parts of the conversations. We've now passed 5,000 of these highlights. There's a growing number of organizations that are partnering with Local Voices Network to do basic kinds of most fundamental community listening, to build awareness and amplify underheard voices through media organizations, to help shape the strategy for community organizations through listening, public processes, as you've just seen today. And we have research partnerships, not only at MIT, but also now University of Madison through Kathy Cramer. So I'll just leave you with this final visual depiction really of the vision here. What started with a few hundred people in Madison has grown now to thousands of people across 28 states have participated. And we really do feel that Local Voices Network could grow into what we think of as a necessary piece of civic infrastructure for a stronger democracy. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Deb, thank you so very much. That was fantastic. And as you can see, there's already a lot of questions coming in the queue. What I want to do is to first tick off a couple of just the clarifying questions that people have asked. And then I'm going to ask you a question or two of my own. And what we're going to do is, to make it a little more interactive and lively, we're going to take a couple of the names here, not everybody, just in the interest of time, and promote them to ask the questions themselves. So just a heads up to Lee that we're going to get started with you, and Tony and Joanna. But let me just pick off, and you can see them along for yourself in the Q&A, just some of the clarifying questions. So you got asked here, for example, who owns the rights to the recordings? The nonprofit, or do the participants reserve any? So let's do these like 10-second questions first.
Sure. Right now, actually, that's an area of active discussion with some of the libraries that we're working out. By default, the nonprofit owns the rights to the recordings, and it gets public consent. There's actually a very explicit consent process at the beginning of each conversation. Although really our main intent is just to be able to leverage sort of the value to make these public. And as we're starting to get into private collections, there are organizations where their use case is to do things within and not make it more publicly available. So we are sort of developing more careful sort of policies to sort of have those protections put in place.
Great. And then you have a question about the languages here from Andres Ramirez. As I saw an audio in Spanish with a transcript in English, does the software work in English with and in other languages like Spanish? So tell us what's going on there with the translation.
Yeah, there's support now for Spanish. We certainly have interest, and the Cortico team is very much dedicated to increasing language support over time. There's just there's ripple through effects throughout the tooling to deal with other languages. So we're kind of working as fast as we can to increase those to
so
other languages.
Great. I'm going to, again, just heads up to folks who've posted questions in the Q&A that we're going to promote you in a moment to ask your questions. I wanted to ask you just two questions first. One is, what do you see as being the primary problem in democracy to which this is the solution? In other words, we've seen lots of great examples here of anti-racist dialogue mechanisms. We've seen lots of examples that you've shown us of really trying to foster social cohesion and reduce the tremendous partisanship and divides that we've seen in our society. I'm curious, though, to the extent to which, and you've shown us a little bit how it's interacted with a local electoral process. Question is, what do you see as being the applications here in terms of governance and in terms of democracy? Is it about building civic cohesion and reducing partisanship, or how does it interact from your perspective with governing?
You know, I think it begins with the kind of possibilities for people to come to a better understanding of one another. So that's sort of the foundation, and the value of having a space where you can listen and learn and speak and be heard. Because without that, I think the sort of fundamental incentives for wanting to participate in the conversation like this, if they're not there, there isn't value just in that small group exchange. And then as a byproduct of that, having this kind of public record, which can be where we can sort of in various ways see patterns, connect the dots, and increasingly enable people, sort of community leaders, to do that themselves. Those are sort of I think the underpinnings for what we're trying to get off the ground to really get scale. In terms of governance, Beth, I mean, this is actually a great place for us to talk more and get ideas from you and others. I think just if you look at the example that I took you through just moments ago around the selections, or having input into the selection of leader, doing this again, what would it take? How different is it from municipality to municipality? What about the other side after a leader is selected, and to create this kind of dialogue with the community? Can we have this kind of flow of communication in a sustainable way? I think that alone, is significant. We're doing projects with organizations that are looking for patterns in order to help set priorities for resource allocation, sort of think about what are sort of concerns that are persistent across organizations. I'll give you another example. We think in the context of public health and public health communication, there could be real value in this kind of ear to the ground listening as a way to have messaging, public health messaging, which is responsive to obstacles to effective communication because of specific community concerns that the public health messengers may not be aware of. So we're actually piloting that concept with some partners in Atlanta. So there's a number of different ways in which we're probing the value of this kind of listening and sort of community-powered understanding, community-powered sense-making.
Fantastic, and I think Leah Diaz asked the same question as I did, but I will say this gives me a chance to say that at 6 o'clock we're going to end our live stream, and if you feel we didn't get your question answered, please stick around after 6 o'clock. If you're watching on Twitter right now, please come to Zoom and join us for a little more informal dialogue. But we're going to promote 3 people to ask their questions while we do that, I'm going to ask you one more, which is really to ask you about the intersection between the tech and the dialogic component. So in many ways, the dialogue and deliberation community has been around for a long time. Your partners are longtime practitioners who have facilitated these kinds of small group living room dialogues for quite some time. The technology you're applying works at tremendous scale, and we could frankly take it to analyze the conversation we're having right now or another large scale conversation using other platforms and especially in the Zoom era. I'm just wondering, and this gets a little bit to Natalia's question about future features, additional analytics tools, and future roadmap for development. Do you see yourself applying the technology also independent of the small dialogue method to other forms of democratic interaction in the future?
So here, it's good to distinguish Cortico from C3, the Center for Constructive Communication. There's the Local Voices Network is it's a program of Cortico. It's the major effort that Cortico is behind. It's also a very significant collaboration for the center. At MIT, our group is also currently doing work in analyzing kind of semantic and topic and thematic and looking at ways people express their identity in different contexts, developing measures of quality of conversation, and all that, those different kinds of topics are being applied across a variety of different types of media data. So we have a deep standing relationship with Twitter in our lab. So we have many projects in looking at the patterns in Twitter data. Reddit, there's a company called Open Web that hosts all of the threaded conversations for the majority of news sites on the internet. We've just started working with them. I mentioned talk radio, so we have actually a massive sort of fire hose of talk radio from across the country that we ingest and transcribe. So we're interested in looking at all of these different kinds of streams that we've now started pulling in cable television streams as well. And Beth, as you probably know or recall, we're quite interested in how these interact. So how does television and social media interact is kind of an area that remains of interest. So we are looking at some of these techniques across many different streams, including also surveys and how might something we surface from some of these streams suggest questions that we can design for a survey to look more at the quantitative side. So there's a broad set of possibilities. I will say one last thing though. When we think about the design of technology and facilitated dialogue of a very, kind of a certain scale and properties, that how to scale the kind of approach that I just described today, it goes beyond the semantic analysis of sort of conversation data as content, and also to the roles, the human roles necessary and that we think actually it would be a mistake to try to automate, because you could never do it as well as a human. And there's a certain kind of agency that we think belongs with the person and should not be an analyst in our lab, should actually be a member of that community. So beyond facilitation, the sort of sense making, we think that there's a set of technologies that flow from what we're doing that takes us down a very different path than if we were saying, how do we do cross-cutting analysis with other kinds of media? So we're increasingly planning to push off in some of those directions as well.
Great. Let's bring some other questioners into the dialogue here, and I'm going to go to Lee Rainey at Pew Research. Oops, Lee, you're muted, or you're not hearing me, one of the two. So I'll tell you what, Tony Earls at Harvard Medical School, you want to ask your question? All right, strike two for three. Joanna, let's see if you, I know you can see me.
Yeah, I'm here, present. This is such an exciting technology. I serve on my local community board here in New York City, and we are constantly struggling with how to, engage community enough for every project. And this just seems like it has infinite scalability. I did have a specific question. I was curious if you had a way of maybe somehow capturing the subtleties of people's verbal delivery within the text analysis. For instance, the farmer did say the word "oh," but she said it with almost a sigh of resignation, frustration. The teacher, when he was speaking, had some nervous laughter that I thought was very telling. Is there a way to tag the dialogue to capture that?
That's interesting. I mean, certainly a human listener can tag, and the tool that I showed is open-ended, where you can add tags. There are so many interesting possibilities to also model and try to do some of that kind of analysis automatically to detect certain kinds of nuance, which we haven't even touched. But I think some of that, the power of voice is what you're just speaking to, which is when it moves a person and they have a way to kind of share that with others, that it carries all that nuance, even if the machine is unable to capture it. We are looking at ways to, it's fascinating, kind of the research questions that open up. How do people choose to self-identify? And in what conversational context do different dimensions of identity become salient? As the kind of corpus continues to grow, we are looking at questions like that on the research side. And so there's a kind of really exciting possibility in the longer term of trying to understand systematically, as you change different elements of a conversational structure, how does it affect both the impact on the participants and the nature of what it draws out in people, and to be able to systematically, in a kind of empirical way, understand that and sort of tune conversation structures.
Great. Now I know that I never know. Do you prefer Tony or Felton?
Tony.
Okay, that's what I thought. Zoom always says Felton, so I wasn't sure. Tony, do you want to ask your question?
Well, Deb, I'm very impressed that you have Kathy Cramer on your team. She's dynamite.
She is a wonderful and such a important collaborator that really has shaped this whole approach.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
But Tony had a question. Yeah, go ahead, please.
The question I have is, does the Madison community regard children as part of democracy? Are they included in the conversation? Alone or together, multi-generationally? But what do people think about children's participation and their inclusiveness in democratic structures?
Yeah, I love that question, and we have a major effort that is in the design phases at MIT to create a pro-social media network for youth. In fact, for kids potentially even under the COPPA age of 13. So we have not involved children to date in Local Voices Network. There's various design considerations and our relationship with the guardians of the kids and so forth that you might have heard there was one youth voice in the clip. So we have done some collaborations with high schools, but I personally have an interest. I'm the father of a 13 and 15-year-old, and they will tell you that they are in these social media spaces, much younger than what Local Voices Network right now reflects. So it's something we want to do. It's something we're planning, not necessarily directly through Local Voices Network, but through some other efforts. And all I can say is thank you for your question. It's something that is front of mind for us, top of mind for us.
I'd like to keep track of how you accomplish that.
Yes, thank you. We'd love to stay in touch.
So Lee, did we get to your question? You don't have to turn on your video, but if you want to chime in, we can squeeze in another quick addition. I know he's there because he's in the chat. So I think we're having some technical difficulties on his end. So I'm going to bring in one last question here. Maybe let's go over to Eric Pennington's question. And sorry that we haven't promoted you, but I'll just read it out loud. He asked, and you can see for yourself here, has there been any attempt to deploy Local Voices Network in rural communities where access to opposing perspectives is often quite limited? If so, how did it go? And if not, any plans in the future? So I take that to really be about two things. One is about sort of the rural aspect of it, but really the question of how do you engineer the creation of opposing view? How do you engineer the deliberation into the context of the conversation?
So on the first, the answer is yes, there are some additional challenges, but in particular in Wisconsin and in some other areas, we are now building out collaborations and hosting conversations in small towns and really just rural parts of the state, which is, again, we're the furthest along because it started there first. To the second question, I'm not sure I completely understood, but the approach here is less to engineer or design to bring people specifically into a single conversation where there may be opposing views. And what tends to happen more is the person who is inviting participants into the conversation often knows or is known by the people who come together. So it creates some kind of a sense of a more trusted environment where you can feel more comfortable sharing your experiences. And one way to think of this is we tend to have participants who are drawn from kind of the same enclave, so to speak, and that the kind of cross-cutting views or the cross-cutting exposure between enclaves tends to happen whether it's when you hear that dairy farmer's voice and read their words in the Milwaukee news story, and you may not have direct exposure to that person, but now you're hearing their voice together with Joanna's observation of the nuance carried through, or through a cross-pollination. You might be in one of these conversations and the host of your conversation decides to play a audio clip, a highlight from a conversation that came from a group that's from a very different enclave, and that might be a rural-urban exchange that happens through that cross-pollination. So there's a couple of ways that can be made possible through Local Voices Network.
Fantastic. What I want to do now is, again, just as announced before, is we're going to momentarily end our live stream. But before we do that, I want to invite people who are on Twitter to come over and join us on Zoom for some follow-on Q&A. And just to let people know that we have a few events coming up. We have on March the 31st, we have a book talk with Mitchell Weiss about at Harvard Business School about his new book, We the Possibility, Harnessing Public Entrepreneurship to Solve Our Most Urgent Problems. And then we're going to have events coming up in April, a whole event on capacity building and talent with 3 different speakers that we'll send out details on. And in May, we're going to have Professor Paul Light on government reform. So details on that to follow. But for everybody who's here, I'm going to put the link. Oops, that's TED. That's your TED Talk. I'm sorry, my cache is not picking up the posting, but I'll put Mitchell Weiss's book talk. I'm going to attempt to put it in the chat here. There we go. That's actually the link. But it's a good thing. I wanted to send people your TED Talk anyway, and there are many great other resources to you online. But let me formally thank IPK and thank Sam for his help in organizing, and thank Deb Roy from the MIT Media Lab for joining us. We'll be signing off on the live stream, and we're going to, for everybody who's in the room, don't go anywhere. We're going to promote everybody to speaker so that we can have a little more informal conversation. And Deb has kindly agreed to stick around for what we like to call our virtual wine and cheese portion of the evening. So stand by for a second while we transport you, and we'll conclude the live stream here. Thank you to all of you on Twitter, and please feel free to sign up for upcoming talks for the Future of Democracy lecture series. And thank you.
Thank you.